Let's look at passage 2. I have elaborated a framework for analyzing the contradictory pulls on Indian nationalist ideology in its struggle against the dominance of colonialism and the resolution it offered to those contradictions. Briefly, this resolution was built around a separation of the domain of culture into two spheres, the material and the spiritual. Okay. It was the material sphere that the claims of Western civilization were most powerful. Science, technology, rational forms of economic organization, modern methods of statecraft. These had given the European countries the strength to subjugate the non-European people. To overcome this domination, the colonized people had to learn those superior techniques of organizing material life and incorporate them within their own cultures. But this could not mean the imitation of West in every aspect of life. For then the very distinction between West and East would vanish. The self-identity of national culture would itself be threatened. Okay. This paragraph is most likely by a historian or a history-based scholar who has written about the dichotomy or the struggle associated with nationalist ideology at the time of British dominance or British colonialism in India. And he has gone about doing it by bifurcating that dominance or bifurcating that influence into two parts. First is the material world, the other is the spiritual world. In the material world, the British colonial powers had greatest, as in British colonial power or whatever the Anglo, जो भी कहते हैं उनको क्या कहते हैं कुछ यहाँ दिया था, European people had something to offer. इसका भारत के टर्म्स में एग्जांपल भी अगर सोचोगे, द एजुकेशन सिस्टम, द इंग्लिश बेस्ड एजुकेशन सिस्टम, द रेलवेज, वो जो गोली बंदूक असला बारूद वाली चीजें, वो सब जो काम चल रहा था, दोज टेक्नोलॉजिकल एडवांसमेंट्स, द टेक्निक्स फॉर मेकिंग क्या कहते हैं टेक्सटाइल मैन्युफैक्चरिंग या टेक्सटाइल प्रोसेसिंग इंडस्ट्री के लिए यूजफुलनेस, ऑल ऑफ दीज ये मटेरियल वर्ल्ड के अंदर इंपैक्ट करने वाली चीजें थी. This is where the Western culture or the Western colonial powers held most sway or had held most appeal. But this did not translate into, chunki Western world held appeal in the material world, that will impact all spheres of life. In fact, the two aspects were mentioned, material and spiritual. Material was linked to Western, and then there was a statement, but this could not mean the imitation of West in every aspect of life. The only aspect left is the spiritual one. Okay. The Discourse of Nationalism shows that the material-spiritual distinction was condensed into an analogous but ideologically far more powerful dichotomy between the outer and the inner. Okay. Ideologically far more powerful. Do you understand? When you call something ideologically far more powerful, you're basically saying this is something that a lot of other people will also understand. This is something that will make the idea universal. This is not something, say, if I talk to you about material and spiritual right now, not everyone would be in a position to understand it appropriately because people have different idea of what spirituality means. But now, if you convert it, if you make an analogy to something that is far more universal and understandable between the outer and the inner, then the power or the situation becomes, or the description becomes more understandable to masses. Applying the inner outer distinction to the matter of concrete day-to-day living separates the social space into ghar and bahir. Okay. And given we are Indians, I would expect ghar and bahir, we know the meaning of the words, but even if you did not, let's say you are a non-native Hindi speaker, or somebody who does not know Hindi at all, they have also gone ahead and described it for you. The home, your world within your home, and the world outside of your home. Okay. The world is external, the domain of the material. The home represents one's inner spiritual self, one's true identity. The world is a treacherous terrain of pursuit of material interests, where practical considerations reign supreme. So even if it results in you bending, see, when you make a statement like this, practical considerations reign supreme, effectively what you're saying is, even if you have to bend the rules a little, even if you have to uh, cross the line a little without getting any repercussions, that is acceptable as long as you get your work done. Which is how we've reached a stage where in management, who are managers? Managers are those who get the job done, regardless of what means they employ to get the job done. And therefore, you have worker exploitation. Therefore, you have all sorts of rampant, seemingly unethical practices happening in the workspace. But चल रहा है. यहाँ पे एक एक्स्ट्रा सा काम देते हैं. There is this person, Dr. Oz. He is contesting for US Senate right now. In his political pitches to the people, he's been saying immigrant, अभी जो अमेरिका में ये illegal immigrants आए हैं, I will stop them from entering, I will bring powerful legislation, I will correct the situation. Just a few weeks back, his family business was charged with a $95 million fine for employing non-documented illegal immigrants. But in the outside world, practical considerations reign supreme. मस्त काम चलता है. Corporate America, there is a very strong consideration. Corporate America does not want immigration to become smooth, because then people who do come into the country are non-documented, do not enjoy the same rights as other citizens, and can be exploited for labor in a much more effective manner. There is these practical considerations, wonderful things. Say practical considerations. If I shift my production to China, then the cost of production goes down, my cost of the product will go down, I will get higher profits. That is seen as an acceptable or revolutionary business strategy. लेकिन वही, if I pay my workers less और मेरे किसी व्यक्ति को नुकसान हो रहा, तब दिक्कत हो जाती. So on and so forth. Now the next idea, from here the idea changes drastically. It is also typically the domain of the male. The home, in its essence, must remain unaffected by the profane activities. There is judgment, the profane activities of the material world, and woman is its representation. Now, I don't know if it was by intention or by accident, but remember, the home in its essence must remain unaffected by the profane activities of the world, and woman is its representation. Woman is the representation of home, not the profane activities of the material world. Home ka representation is woman, outside world ka representation is male. And so one gets an identification of social roles by gender to correspond with the separation of the social space into ghar and bahir. Okay. When I read it for the first time, I was perplexed. Is this sexism coming in front of us in the form of a passage? But then we can't spend too much time on that thought, because we have to ask you to solve. The colonial situation and the ideological response of nationalism to the critique of Indian tradition introduced in entirely new substance to these dichotomies and effected their transformation. Let us read this line again, because very difficult to understand. The colonial situation and the ideological response of nationalism to the critique of Indian tradition introduced an entirely new substance to these dichotomies and effected their transformation. The material, abhi bhi nahi pata kya hai, so I'm highlighting this line. I am highlighting this line up till here, and if the question so demands, I will come back and try to make sense of it later. The material spiritual dichotomy to which the terms world and home corresponded had acquired a very special significance in the nationalist mind. The world was where the European power had challenged the non-European peoples. Okay. Hopefully we remember peoples. Is this correct usage of English? Of course it is. You can use peoples when you're referring to people from multiple nations. You can only use people when you're referring to people of a singular nation, because non-European peoples, all the colonies are being referred to here. Peoples is an acceptable term. And by virtue of its superior material culture, had subjugated them. Europeans had come into power because of the material superiority or superiority in the material domain. But the nationalists asserted it had failed to colonize the inner essential identity of the East, which lay in its distinctive and superior spiritual culture. You have better means of production. You have better form of government. You have better forms of transportation. But we are still better than you because we know deep down inside or spiritually we are superior than you. Okay. In the entire phase of national struggle, the crucial need was to protect, preserve, and strengthen the inner core of the national culture, its spiritual essence. The dichotomy, hopefully you understand, is where in the material world, you have to understand, appreciate, and submit yourself to European superiority है भाई, ठीक है, वो लेना पड़ेगा क्योंकि better है. But spiritual world में और inner world में you could not afford to do that. Inner world में, spiritual world में अपना ही spiritual world better है, अपना spiritual culture better है. That was the dichotomy. यहाँ पे ये जीत रहे हैं, यहाँ पे हम जीत रहे हैं. Okay. Once we match this new learning of the home world dichotomy with the identification of social roles by gender, we get the ideological framework. Within which nationalism answered the women's question. It would be a grave error to see in this, as liberals are apt to, in their despair at many marks of social conservatism in national practice, a total rejection of the West. Okay, quite the contrary. The national paradigm, in fact, supplied an ideological principle of selection. Again, this paragraph is not easy to comprehend in the first read, so a second read and insertions in between. Once we match this new meaning of the home world dichotomy with the identification of social roles by gender. So social roles, males were assigned the outside world, the females were assigned to the inside world. We get the ideological framework within which nationalism answered the woman's question. The woman's question is, what role were they serving in the society? Kya rakha tha, kyun rakha tha? Not really specified or not really clear to me. I will let it be. It would be a grave error to see in this, as liberals are apt to, in their despair at the many marks of social conservatism in national practice. You cannot claim it was sexism or it was social conservatism that led to women being given the role or being consigned to the category of ghar and men being consigned to the role of bahir. It wasn't a matter of superiority and inferiority between men and women. It was a matter of categorization, or it was simply a matter of labeling that led to men bahir ghar and women ghar. A total, and of course, this labeling or this categorization should also not be seen as an absolute rejection of the West. ये नहीं हुआ था कि भाई, just because you continue to maintain this inside वाले world के अंदर bifurcation, और या inside world and outside world के बीच का dichotomy, or you continue to give importance to the superiority of your own spiritual culture, this cannot be taken as proof of absolute rejection of the West. The West was not absolutely rejected. Quite the contrary, the nationalist paradigm, in fact, supplied an ideological principle of selection. In fact, the national paradigm, the national school of thought, in fact, supplied an ideological principle of selection. Ijat se, ideological principle of selection, absolutely no clue. क्या नहीं, पता नहीं क्या कहना चाह रहा है. But the national paradigm, I can only guess here, the national paradigm would be in reference to उस टाइम पे जो नेशनल के अंदर थॉट प्रोसेस चल रहा था, स्कूल ऑफ थॉट चल रहा था, दैट वाज द कॉज ऑफ व्हाई मेन वर द आउटसाइड वर्ल्ड एंड वुमेन वर द इनसाइड वर्ल्ड. This is my understanding of the passage. Let's get to individual questions. First one, on the basis of the information in the passage, all of the following are true about spiritual material dichotomy of Indian nationalism, except that it helped in safeguarding the identity of Indian nationalism. represented and continuation of age-old oppositions in Indian culture, constituted the premise of Ghar-Bahar dichotomy, was not as ideologically powerful as inner-outer dichotomy. Okay. About the spiritual material dichotomy is something that is mentioned in the first paragraph. In the second paragraph, they went on to discuss in great detail how it was the inner-outer distinction that made it more appealing to masses, more identifiable. So option D can be rejected. In fact, this inner-outer dichotomy was extended into the Ghar-Bahar dichotomy. So this is also gone. Now between A and B, the choice here will lie between A and B. Helped in safeguarding the identity of Indian nationalism and represented a continuation of age-old opposition in Indian culture. Now see the spiritual material dichotomy, dividing the world into two domains, the outside and the inside, or spiritual and material. What this did was, it led to acceptance of, okay, Western culture or Western people were better off, superior in technology, in the forms of government. There were areas that they were better in the material world. And okay, that acceptance, that assimilation is acceptable. But in the spiritual world, you had to assert or believe in your own superiority, which ensured that this remained distinct. But this could not mean the imitation of West in every aspect of life. For this very distinction between the West and the East would vanish, the self-identity of national culture would itself be threatened. So the spiritual material distinction helped in safeguarding the identity of Indian nationalism is implied in this line. So this is also gone. Answer has to be represented a continuation of age-old oppositions in Indian culture. Within this paragraph or within this passage, there has not been a mention of the male and female representations of Ghar and Bahir, material world and the spiritual world, is something that is continuing from the ancient Indian culture. It is, and which is why, pay attention, even if you have that extra information, the wording of the question is wonderful based on the information in the passage. There is no information in the passage about age-old oppositions in Indian culture. It is only in the Indian culture, a representation, a form of analogous dichotomy that you can create was male and female that was told. So option B will be the right answer here. Question 6. Which one of the following explains the contradictory pulls on Indian nationalism? The contradictory pulls here being, in the Bahir world, in the material world, Western superiority; in the Ghar, in the spiritual world, Indian or the local superiority. Okay. Which one of the following explains contradictory pulls on Indian nationalism? Despite the fight against colonial domination, Indian nationalism had to borrow from the colonizer in the spiritual sphere. While I'm never in favor of rejecting an option straight away or option A straight away, this option is outright wrong. This cannot possibly be true. The entire passage was about how in the spiritual sphere, we did not borrow from the colonizer. We only limited it to the material sphere. Our spiritual sphere, we kept it safeguarded from the Western world. But take a option B. Despite its scientific and technological inferiority, Indian nationalism had to fight against colonial domination. Between A and B, I would of course say B is better because A is outright wrong. But even the framing of B is slightly challenging. Despite its scientific and technological inferiority, Indian nationalism had to fight against colonial domination. Two things. These are not contradictory pulls at all. This is simply a disadvantage that the Indian nationalism or the Indian population at the time had. Additionally, the Indian nationalism strengthened its fight against colonial domination by focusing on the internal world. And what is mentioned in the passage here is the Western domination of the material world. So the framing of the option is a challenge, but between B and A, B still survives. Let's look at C. Despite its fight against colonial domination, Indian nationalism had to borrow from the colonizer in the material sphere. Now between B and C, C is much, much better because this is a dichotomy. I'm trying to fight you. I'm trying to fight you at the same time, or also accepting what you have to offer. I'm trying to fight you, yet I'm accepting what you have to offer in the material sphere. This is a dichotomy. This is an option, two things that are contradictory in nature, that do not, that shouldn't ideally go together, but this was happening. So between B and C, C is better. Option D, despite its spiritual superiority, Indian nationalism had to fight against colonial domination. If there is superiority that you have, then you don't really have to fight. If you already had superiority, you don't really have to fight. And additionally, the challenge here is, again, this is talking of spiritual superiority, that the contradictory pulse was, while you're objecting to it, there are pieces of it that you're assimilating and making a part of your own self, which is not being mentioned in option D. So C survives, and C is the best choice here. Question 7. Which one of the following, if true, would weaken the author's claims in the passage? First one, the colonial period saw the hybridization of Indian culture in all realms as it came in contact with British European culture. Was it in all realms? Not really. They had limited it to the material realm and tried to keep it away from the spiritual realm. So, if true, would weaken, ka matlab, something that is against what is given in the passage. A seems like a good option for the time being. Option B, forces of colonial modernity played an important role in shaping anti-colonial nationalism. If forces of colonial modernity played an important role in shaping anti-colonial Indian nationalism, either this is a neutral statement that doesn't really weaken or strengthen the author's stance, or if you were to take this interpretation forward, material world mein we took from colonial modernity, and therefore our anti-colonial Indian nationalism got some boost when we were trying to oppose the colonial powers. You can make an argument by extending it, but on the face of it, it is a very neutral statement, definitely not weakening what is given in the passage. Between A and B, B gets away. C, Indian nationalists rejected the cause of English education for women during the colonial period. If Indian nationalists rejected the cause of English education for women during the colonial period, it would be because women were restricted to ghar, the internal world, and if we allowed them to have education, or we let them go into the bahir world, the distinction that was created, the lines would get blurred. The fact that there was a restriction in place, it doesn't really weaken the author's claims in the passage, it strengthens it, because there was a clear-cut distinction between the outside world and the inside world. So between A and C, C gets rejected. Option D, the Industrial Revolution played a crucial role in shaping the economic prowess of Britain in the 18th century. Now this Industrial Revolution, this was precisely mentioned. It was in the material world that the claims of Western civilization were most powerful. Science, technology, and rational forms of economic organization, modern methods in statecraft. This had given the European countries the strength to subjugate non-European people. So the fact that the Industrial Revolution played a crucial role in shaping the economic prowess of Britain in the 18th century, this would strengthen the claims in the passage. So this is not the answer. We are left with option A, especially on account of the fact all realms have been mentioned here. This is going against the grain of what was mentioned in the passage. Okay. Question 8. Which one of the following best describes the liberal perception of Indian nationalism? This is a question that I dreaded for the simple reason, the liberal understanding, liberals and this and that, this sentence here, this was precisely the area in the passage that I did not have absolute understanding of, but that doesn't mean we will not attempt. We will go through the options one after the other. Indian nationalist discourses reaffirmed traditional gender roles for Indian women. Now this, in in confluence with option 5, age-old oppositions in Indian culture, and reaffirm the traditional gender roles. Can you see? These are very similar ideas. Here, we were saying this was not being referenced in the passage. So here, of course, the same challenge remains. It is not being referenced in the passage, which makes E a bad option here. Here, B had turned into a good option because we were looking for except. Here, it is turning into a bad option because we are looking for something that best describes the liberal perception of nationalism, Indian nationalism. Okay. Let's go to option B. Oh. Indian nationalism embraced wait a minute. I'm making a mistake here. Which one of the following best describes the liberal perception of the Indian nationalism? Within the passage, it was mentioned, it would be a grave error to see in this, as liberals are apt to, in their despair, at the many marks of social conservatism in national practice. Okay. So liberals usually make the error of seeing social conservatism in national practice. Okay. So A being incorrect is something that the liberals, or A being incorrect is something that makes this option stronger. Okay, this survives. B. Indian nationalism embraced the changes brought about by colonialism in Indian women's traditional gender roles. Okay. Colonialism did not bring about a change in Indian women's traditional roles by, according to liberals or any other version. So between A and B, B is worse, A survives. Indian nationalist discourses provided an ideological principle of selection. This ideological principle of selection, I don't know what it meant, but at the same time, it was quite the contrary to the understanding of liberals. So it possibly cannot be the something that best describes the liberal perception of Indian nationalism. So C is also gone. A and C, A survives. Option D, Indian nationalism's sophistication resided in its distinction of the material from the spiritual spheres. The liberals were making the error of saying the fact that social conservatism was there in the national practice. This proves that there was a total rejection of the West. So Indian nationalism sophistication resided in distinction of material from the spiritual spheres. If the liberals were dividing the world into these two distinct spheres, then they would not say an absolute rejection of the West. Their argument would not be created, and therefore D is incorrect. What remains is option A, which I was previously eliminating, but this will be the answer correct one here. I had misinterpreted the question in the first go. That is all for this second passage.